WatchCharts is the world's leading secondary watch market research platform. Dive into the data yourself at WatchCharts.com. Everyone knows the usual references from Rolex, but the brand has made hundreds of watches over the decades, and it's impossible virtually for all of them to occupy the public consciousness or even an enthusiast's conscious for very long. In this video, we'll cover 5 references from the crown that you may not have known about. These aren't, relatively speaking, ancient unobtainium Paul Newman Daytonas, 100 Submariners, or triple calendars from the 40s and 50s, or anything particularly exotic like that. In some cases, they're actually fairly recently produced watches, which makes the fact that they're not more widely known or have seen much hype around them even more remarkable. However, every watch we will cover in this video had a relatively small production run, and so there are only so many of them out there, so they'll never be as common as your run-of-the-mill, two-tone Datejust or your steel Submariners. We'll look at the available market data where possible and even some currently active listings for these watches. And as always, we welcome you to check out the listings and the rest of the data for yourself at WatchCharts.com. Let us know in the comments if there are other watches that you would like us to cover. With that, the first submission that we will make here is the Rolex Cellini Prince reference 5441. And what makes this watch special is a number of features about it. Number one, most striking, and especially considering that Rolex is now doing this again in their professional watches starting this year with the Platinum Daytona, this watch had an exhibition case back. And that exhibition case back showed you a shaped rectangular movement. The more sort of like the features that I run through with this watch, the more bonkers it sounds. And then the fact that Rolex is the brand that was making these is just very surprising for somebody who came to learn more about watches in, let's say, the last 5 to 7 years, which is certainly the category that I fall into, to know that brand like Rolex was producing a watch like this. So these were made in precious metals. They were rectangular shaped, manual wind, and are a homage to a doctor's watch that Rolex used to make way back in the 20s, I believe. They were made from 2005 to 2015. We don't really know how many, but production is likely to have been very limited because of all of the other factors we've discussed. There's a few variations that you can get for dial colors and metals as well, but all of them will be precious metal. And then if you go hunting for listings, there's a wide range depending on condition and completeness of box and papers and those sorts of elements. But if we look at the 3-year price history for the Cellini Prince, again, specifically this reference 5441, which is the one in white gold, over the last 3 years, this watch has appreciated by about 25%, but that's largely sort of avoided the crazy hype and then correction that we saw in the market in 2021. Once the price sort of appreciated to the level that it's at now, which was just over a year ago, it's more or less held steady at that level since then. These watches, relatively speaking, are still, I would submit, a little bit undervalued for really the amount of specialness that you're getting for the money. Certainly, if you compare this to a stock steel Submariner that you could buy on the pre-owned market, regardless of generation, something like this has way more character and is likely to be far rarer. A listing that came out very recently on eBay for this watch from a reputable seller is listed for $11,275 for a watch from 2005. So they are out there, but they don't come up very often. And that's true both on seller platforms like eBay as well as on the forums. The next watch we'll talk about is the Datejust Turnograph reference 116264. And the first time you look at this watch, it may not immediately be obvious why it's special, but there's a couple of things that should stick out the longer you stare at it. One is that the bezel, which on a normal Datejust is just fully fluted, this one has markings for the 10 minutes, basically all the way around up to 60. And that bezel is not fixed on this watch. It's actually movable in both clockwise and counterclockwise directions. So it's a Datejust, but it has this movable bezel, which is more sort of, a feature associated with a professional watch from Rolex, not a classic watch. And then the second thing is that the second hand is of bright, vibrant color that contrasts sort of very strongly with the rest of the design of the watch. And the turnograph is sort of like this weird, I would consider it almost like like a black sheep, where it's a classic watch, but it has this additional functionality that lets it work kind of like a tool watch, or it's a sort of like a variation on a theme. But this isn't something that Rolex just sort of drew out of a hat. It's something that has been part of their catalog since 1953. And in fact, this particular reference, the 116264, launched in 2004. It was discontinued in 2011. And if you try and go looking for one of these, just to give you a sense of how rare, relatively speaking, they are. If you look at the number of Datejust listings on Chrono24, that number is around 34,000 listings. Only a little more than 500 of those, so fewer than 2% of all active listings just for Datejusts, are turnographs. And if you look at the 5-year price history for this watch, it's sort of seen an appreciation, and it's had a spike in its value as well. And that's likely because it's conventional, still sort of like largely conventional looking in its design, except for the added functionality in the bezel. So it's not something more exotic like the Cellini Princes that we looked at. But again, the price on these has gone up by about 50%. But for a Datejust, if you want to go buy a 36 millimeter Datejust at retail today, those will start at more than $7,700, which is what the current market price for this watch is. And the market price for those Datejusts will be even higher. So coming back to the idea of, slight variations on a theme, like if you compare this to an Explorer 2, for example, right, which is taking a GMT Master, or taking the idea of a GMT Master and then basically just replacing the rotating bezel with a fixed bezel. So it's like one, design-wise, it's like sort of one element off, or one element that changed, that fundamentally changes in some ways the character of the watch. Here, what's happening is basically the same thing, where you add this utilitarian, element to the design. It's the same way that, like, for example, Rolex will do green dials for some watches, and then, it becomes sort of like its own thing. The question that this raises for me really at this juncture is, how much staying power these sorts of design variations can have. Because if we look at another example from sort of the modern catalog from Rolex, the Wimbledon dial has been in production since 2019. So that's about 14 years now. And everything Rolex makes obviously is going to have a finite production run. So let's say they stop making them today. There's a significant market premium for those dials. Would the market still want that much of a premium for a Wimbledon dial 10 years from now if they had been discontinued for 10 years? Or is there some sort of, inevitable sort of moving on of the market from things that got discontinued and left behind? And Turnograph got discontinued in 2011. And so now, 12 years later, this is not something that occupies, the sort of public conversation around Rolex watches, certainly not, around watches on YouTube generally, in the watch media, in local collector discussions that I have experience with. And this is just merely 12 years after this got discontinued. So just something to think about in terms of a staying power, really, of any particular design variation or utilitarian variation on these watches. If you wanted to buy one, there's a listing from May 15 on Reddit from a reputable seller for $7,750, which is sort of smack right on top of the market price for this watch. And, it's box and papers and comes from 2006. And it's the particularly fetching slate gray dial with the red secondhand implementation. The third watch that we will submit, and this is a submission from Charles, is the Rolex Sea Dweller reference 116600. And what makes this watch special is that it was the last Sea Dweller with a 40 millimeter case and that did not have a Cyclops over the date window. And so at first glance from a distance, it might seem like it's a Submariner, but the closer you look at it, the more you're going to come to realize what you're dealing with is something that is, 3 times as capable, while not looking wildly different. It was made only from 2014 to 2017, and so because it had a limited production run, there's also going to be very few of these. Retail for these was around $10,400 when they were discontinued, and so if we look at how the market price over the last 5 years, basically since its discontinuation, has trended, it's only gone up. And so the market clearly does seem to appreciate this watch in terms of its value, but it was because it's a professional watch, it was not immune to, again, the hype and the correction from 2022. And then there's a recent listing for this watch from May 18 for $14,850 for a complete set from 2017. So again, this watch is available out there. You just won't see it that commonly as you will some other watches. And so so far what we've talked about are mechanical watches, but if you have stuck around this far in this video, it is likely that you may be interested to find out or may not have known that Rolex used to make quartz watches as well. They actually had 2 separate attempts at making quartz watches, and so we'll cover both of the watches that they made during that time period. And the first one is the day-date Oysterquartz reference 19018, and then a variation of that, which is the 19019. And this is this was introduced in 1977, and then the Oysterquartz watches remained in Rolex's catalog all the way up to 2001. So it's wild to think that fewer than 25 years ago, you could actually buy a Rolex at retail that would be battery powered. The 19018 is in yellow gold. The 19019 is in white gold. Both of them have the day-date functionality. They're integrated bracelet watches. And, the Oysterquartz movement as a whole is known to have about 25,000 units out there total. And so the 19018 and the 19019 are going to be, vanishingly small portions of that. And then there's even further variations of the day date that have sort of the Florentine finish on the bracelet and the case, the pyramid finished bezel and bracelet, dial variations of all sorts, and depending on condition and completeness of set and, box and papers and that sort of thing, and location even in some cases, prices for these can sort of climb very, very rapidly from where the market price is that we compute, which is, just under $15,000, which has seen a little bit of appreciation again over the last 5 years, but, again, nothing insane like some of the valuations that, we saw shoot up over the course of just let's say a year over the last 24 months. The interesting thing about this watch also is that because it's such few units, but over such a long period of time, if you want to be picky about the specific listing that you want to go after and you really want to start hunting and say, okay, I want to get something from the 90s, but again, in precious metal with the day-date configuration for an Oysterquartz, that's something that is a bit of a challenge to go out and hunt for. And there I speak a little bit from personal experience because the 19018 was on my wish list for some time before I ended up buying a 17000, which is the just the plain Jane steel version of this watch. And because it's sort of stretching back into the late 70s, which is solidly into the vintage period, you do have to be a little careful about checking for condition and making sure you're buying from someone you trust and so on and so forth. But if you wanted to nevertheless look at a listing for this watch, here's one that's just on the market price for $14,500 from 1982 with, it's described as a lemon dial. So there's all of these sort of more intricate details that start becoming interesting with these watches that really, you can't really get with modern watches necessarily. But it's interesting that, in this price range, you can still buy precious metal integrated bracelet watches from Rolex, no less. And so even if you knew about the Oysterquartz watches, maybe this one is the one that you really did not know about, which is the Rolex Datejust Reference 5100. And what makes this special is that while it is a quartz watch, it is not an Oysterquartz. It's actually from 1970, so at least 7 years before the Oysterquartz Reference 17000 and the 19018 and their sort of, successors came out and became available. This was a Beta 21 movement, and the Beta 21 movement was developed along with several other watch brands in collaboration, but it was released in 1970, and so was beaten to market by Seiko for the first quartz watch, which is the 35SQ. But again, this was an integrated bracelet precious metal quartz watch from Rolex. They were only made in yellow gold or white gold. They're all engraved with the serial numbers on the back, which are numbered. And the internet's best guess for how many are out there is between 1,000 to 1,500. Of the images that I've been able to find, I've seen serial numbers up to about, I believe, 700 something. But are there 1,000? Are there 1,500? I think it's one of those questions where it's very difficult really for us to know. And if you just want to go for sort of like the simple variations of these, which are yellow gold and have silver dials, prices on those range from about $25,000 to about $40,000, depending on condition, location, completeness, and so on and so forth. But anytime you get to a variation of this watch, it starts sort of ballooning in cost way, way past that. I think to just sort of underscore this point, Rolex has tried twice in its history to make quartz watches, and it was making them as recently as 2001, and they've discontinued them. But what's stopping them from seriously considering bringing quartz back into their catalog at some point? When we say, let's cover Rolex watches we don't know exist, yes, that implies watches that Rolex has already made, but in some sense, we can even talk about watches or speculate about watches that Rolex may make in the future, and that it is in fact working on right now. So, what is stopping Rolex from investing in quartz again and eventually reviving Oysterquartz in some way? Because of course, and I'm not going to spend time in this video necessarily going into it, but Oysterquartz really is a fundamentally different implementation of quartz movements from regular quartz. And so would Rolex do something special like that even though it's a quartz watch, still makes it special and still makes it Rolex and still makes it unique in that way, and bring, quartz watches back now over 50 years after they first attempted them? I don't know if something like that would ever happen, but I'm sure if it did, as with everything else that Rolex does, people would lose their minds. But let us know in the comments below if there were any watches in this list that you really did learn about for the first time, or if there are others that you think we could have included in this list. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next one.